Hello and welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring today's most pressing global issues into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Excitement and uncertainty fill the air as we're just a week away from a pivotal U.S. presidential election. Public interest is high, with recent reports showing a surge in early voting. Over 43 million Americans have already cast their ballots, setting a record for participation. Now, in the final stretch before the 2024 presidential election, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are concentrating on crucial battlegrounds, Michigan and Georgia. Harris rallied in Ann Arbor, emphasizing individual freedoms and reproductive rights, while Trump addressed Atlanta voters, attacking his opponents and encouraging them to vote on Election Day. For the rest of the week, both candidates are expected to travel across the country to make their last-minute sprint and win voters over. So now the big question is, will America get its first female president or a second Donald Trump reign? For answers to this, we're joined by our go-to VOA correspondent, Chris Casquejo. Welcome, Chris.
Good to be with you.
And also joining us is Peter K. Lee, Research Fellow at Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Great to have you, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
So, Chris, let's start with you. The U.S. presidential election is just a week away, like I said, but various polls indicate that it's still quite difficult to predict the outcome.
That's correct. National polls show a tight race with just days to go, with Harris or Trump slightly ahead, but they're both within the margin of error. But most importantly, those battleground states that we always talk about also show a tight race, with basically a statistical tie in the 7 states that experts believe will determine the next president of the United States. We continue to make this point because the presidential election is a series of state-by-state contests, not a national popular vote, with the winning candidate needing to get 270 electoral votes.
Right. Now, with candidate support rates neck and neck in the polls, it seems like the battleground states will be key in deciding the winner, just as our Chris mentioned. So, Mr. Lee, why are these states extra important, and what are your projections for the situation in these states?
So I think, as Chris was mentioning, there are really 7 states at stake here. And it's such a close margin of error within sort of 1%, I think, out of 6 or 7 of them. But I think, if we think back to the last presidential election, President Biden won with basically 44,000 votes out of Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. If we think back about 8 years ago to 2016, President Trump won that election with about 80,000 votes out of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So there's really, a tight margin of error out of an election of, so many million people. So I think that's where the swing states, and that's why so much presidential campaign effort and resources have been going to these states. I think that's really crucial to understand, particularly for Korean audiences, because of the electoral college system, which is very different to how elections are done elsewhere.
Right. So, Mr. Lee, is there a specific reason why these states are called swing states?
So I think, there's such a tight margin of error that, depending on the election, the voters in those states can go different ways. So if you think back almost 20 years ago or 24 years ago, if you think back to Al Gore and George Bush, Florida was a swing state back then. Over time, it's progressively become a more conservative state, so now it leans Republican. But at each U.S. presidential election, and even in the midterms, we see that the different states begin to vote in different ways, I think. So for this 2024 election, it's going to be these 7 states.
Right. Thank you for the explanation. Now, in terms of strategy, negative campaigning between Democratic candidate Kamala Harris and Republican candidate Donald Trump is heating up. First, Chris, is this common in the U.S., this negative campaigning? And I wonder, how are American voters responding to these negative emotions?
Yes, it's very common because research has shown time and time again that it works. And there was a Trump rally on Sunday that was meant to serve as his closing message, but he's faced some backlash because of what many perceived as racist comments, including a comedian who called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. And those were comments that the Trump campaign later disavowed. And later today, VP Kamala Harris will give her closing arguments at the Ellipse, the same spot at the White House where Trump spoke on January 6, 2021, shortly before his supporters attacked the Capitol. Harris is expected to focus her remarks on the danger that Trump presents to U.S. democracy. She has stepped up her attacks, calling him a fascist in recent days, but she's expected to touch on broader themes tonight, driving home the stakes of the November 5th election for undecided voters who might be uncomfortable with Trump's divisive leadership and extreme rhetoric. And these are moderate Republicans who might be unwilling to vote for Trump again and might consider Harris. A lot of the voters who supported Nikki Haley in the primary process against Donald Trump.
Right, so this negative campaigning method is very common. Then why are the two candidates focusing more on these negative attacks instead of promoting their policies? Mr. Lee, how much more is this negative campaigning effective?
I think they are trying to sort of put forward their policy agenda in the midst of this negative campaigning. I think it's worth thinking back even, about 2 months ago to after the presidential assassination attempt on President Trump. We think about that, at the Republican National Congress, where he was talking about, bringing unity, right? And it was taking a very different approach. And he was saying things like, the discord and division in our society must be healed. But there was that brief moment, I think, where they were trying to get beyond the negative campaigning. And much like Vice President Kamala Harris, when she took over the Democratic nomination, she tried to sort of, I guess, channel some of that Obama era, optimism, hope, and unity. So I think, there was that opportunity to have a very different kind of campaign, but I think both sides have really reverted back to their, standard modus operandi, I think. And I think that's partly a reflection of, the high stakes in this election. Both sides have made this out that if they lose, it's the end of the world, really. And I think that has really sort of driven some of this vitriol, some of this extreme rhetoric on both sides.
Right. So this negative campaigning method is quite effective, I guess. That's why they're both focusing on that.
I think it's really about trying to drive turnout, right? You were mentioning at the opening that many millions of Americans have already started to vote with only a week left. It's really about getting those last few people who might have made up their mind but might not go to the ballot box on election day. It's really about to get those people passionate and riled up to go vote next week.
Right, and I'm guessing social media would play a big role in this negative campaigning, effectiveness of this negative campaigning, right?
Absolutely, and I think in the midst of that, we have fake news, misinformation, and everything designed to really tap people's impulses to get them really passionate about these issues, even with the wrong information, I think, and that's really the dangerous component.
Right. Now, as Mr. Lee just pointed out, the number of early voters for the U.S. presidential election reached a record high in several states. Now, what does this high early voting rate indicate, and which candidate might benefit from this, Chris?
Yeah, at last check, more than 46 million voters have already voted in this election. Now, usually Democrats have an advantage in early voting, but so far, at least, Republicans are taking part at a much higher rate than they normally do. Trump, for his part, for years has encouraged his supporters to cast only in-person ballots, but he has backed off on that in recent months as he and the GOP have acknowledged the obvious benefit of banking votes early. Because of Republican participation, the early turnout was breaking records last week in the swing states of North Carolina and Georgia. But the GOP has really focused more on election integrity and questioning whether elections are secure rather than a traditional get out the vote operation, which the Democrats have invested billions in. So it's unclear whether the uptick in Republican early voting will continue and which candidate it will help, because obviously you can figure out which party is voting early, but that still doesn't account for people who might be Republicans but crossing over to vote for Democrat Kamala Harris or Democrats who might be voting for Donald Trump. Yeah, it probably is a rare case, but there is always that possibility in either case.
Right, so we'll have to wait and see until the rest of the week which direction the votes will go. Now, Chris, one of the biggest issues these days is North Korean troops reportedly being deployed to Russia to participate in its war with Ukraine. And some say this could act as a variable in the U.S. election. How is public opinion analyzing this?
Yeah, well, it's important to note that the most important issues are still the economy, immigration, and abortion. So U.S. elections aren't really decided on foreign policy, but they just present a general picture of the candidate who might be taking the office in the White House. On Joe Rogan's podcast, Trump repeated concerns that the enemy from within the country poses a more dangerous threat than foreign governments. And this time he was talking about his relationship with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. Trump said, "I got along great with him." Trump was the first president ever to set foot inside North Korea. Now, VP Harris has vowed to continue America's global leadership if elected, raising expectations that she's going to forge ahead with Biden's policy of centering a U.S. network of allies and partners to confront shared challenges, including North Korea's threats and Russia's aggression in Ukraine. During her nomination speech in August, she said she will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un, who are rooting for Trump, remarks that indicate she would carry out a conventional diplomatic approach with states like North Korea rather than seeking direct diplomacy with the North Korean ruler. So it's more of a continuation of Biden's foreign policy and shoring up alliances in the region, whereas many analysts say that Donald Trump is more of a wild card in this case.
Mm-hmm. Now, like Chris just pointed out, former President Donald Trump mentioned North Korean Chairman Kim Jong-un again during a podcast on the 25th. He said he got to know Kim Jong-un better than anybody. Mr. Lee, what is Trump's intention behind mentioning the North's leader?
So I guess before getting to sort of Donald Trump's views of Kim Jong-un, I mean, going back to Chris's discussion just there about the North Korean dispatch of troops to Ukraine, this marks an unprecedented escalation on the part of North Korea. And I think for many U.S. allies, there are going to be serious questions around U.S. deterrence and whether it has actually succeeded in stopping this alignment that we see taking place, right? It's been a very piecemeal, provocations over time for the last 2 years in terms of North Korea's intervention into Ukraine. And really the question is, has the U.S. been able to stop that, to deter that, and to punish or respond to that kind of escalation? So I think that therein is the question around how U.S. allies are looking at this, but also domestically in the U.S., right? The question about has U.S. leadership under the Biden and Harris administration been effective at stopping coercion and provocations by regimes like North Korea, Russia, China, and Iran? I think that's really where the debate is. But as Chris was saying, it's going to be largely for domestic issues. Now, going back to your point about President Trump's, romance with Kim Jong-un, and he's sort of returning to that theme, I think there are at least 2 reasons for that. I think the first is really that we've seen over the last 8 years that President Trump ascribes to this sort of great man theory of history. That, all of international affairs is essentially, distilled into the works of great men, such as himself, obviously. So I think he looks at the North Korea-US sort of example as, an illustration of how he has been able to overcome, bureaucratic forces, economic forces, the intricacies of government, and to really just deal with a leader, as he always did in business. So I think that's where he comes at that issue. The second part, I think, is really that he looks at the history of US dealing with North Korea under his administration as a success story. And he sort of tries to contrast that with what he argues is the weak or incompetent or ineffective approach of the Biden administration. So I think that's where he's trying to show that the contrast between how he has dealt with strong and tough and challenging dictators and strongmen, and that he's actually quite at ease with that compared to the Biden-Harris administration.
Right, so he's kind of showing off his confidence in resolving these kinds of conflicts, especially with his former relations with Chairman Kim. Now, given the tight race, some people speculate that it would be difficult to determine the winner even on election night. So, Chris, how did past elections unfold during similar neck-and-neck situations?
Well, the 2000 election outcome was not decided until 5 weeks after Election Day. A few hundred votes separated the candidates in Florida, and that brought out a bunch of lawsuits and recounts in full force, including disputes about confusing or improperly punched ballots, missing names on voter rolls, and multiple requests for ID for minority voters. 5 weeks after the election, the U.S. Supreme Court had the final word, ruling by a narrow majority to stop the recount ordered by the Florida Supreme Court on the grounds that it violated the constitutional principle that all votes must be treated equally. George W. Bush, who won 30 states, counting Florida, maintained a razor-thin 5-vote majority in the Electoral College, and he was the first candidate in 112 years to win the presidency without winning the popular vote. Al Gore actually got more than 500,000 votes in the popular vote that year, but by a slim majority of 537 votes in Florida, which was then a battleground state, as we've discussed, Bush prevailed in the Electoral College. And it's important to note that certain states, including Pennsylvania, which has the largest number of electoral votes at stake in the so-called battleground states, cannot start counting its absentee or mail-in ballots until Election Day, and that's particularly going to be an issue in large metropolitan areas with large populations like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, the biggest population centers in that battleground state.
Right, so we won't be able to, we're most likely not going to be able to know the results on that day, on Election Day, right?
Correct. That's what a lot of experts predict. But of course, we're already in the presidential race. So it's a matter of how turnout does against the polls, because polls are a snapshot in time. This election right now is about which voters are turning out for which candidate. Right,
of course. Now, amid these various concerns about recounts, potential lawsuits, what are the last-minute scenarios and variables that could decide the outcome of the two candidates, Mr. Lee?
I mean, so U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld once talked about unknown unknowns, right? The things that we don't know, that we don't even know we don't know. So I think, if you look back at this presidential race over the last few months, there's been things that nobody could have imagined happening, right? 6 months ago, everybody thought this would be President Biden versus former President Trump. 3-4 months ago, nobody would have expected that President Biden would drop out. Nobody would have expected 2 assassination attempts, right? So many things have happened in the last few months that I think few people could have imagined that even the next 7 days, it's all bets are off, I think, in terms of what could happen.
Right. So it really depends on how things will unfold. What about Chris? What kind of variables do you think could shake in the results?
I want to take you back to 2016 when then FBI Director James Comey released a letter to Congress that federal investigators had learned of new emails pertinent into the investigation into Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server when she was Secretary of State. Now, he sent that letter on October 28th of 2016. So I would say that it wouldn't be a surprise to expect a late October surprise with just a few days left, or even an early November surprise. And it could be that this backlash over the comments at the Madison Square Garden rally are part of that, because we've seen a lot of Puerto Rican artists like Bad Bunny, Jennifer Lopez, Mark Anthony mobilize on social media, and that could be crucial in a battleground state like Pennsylvania with a large Puerto Rican population. So we'll have to see if that might be the October surprise, because a lot of Democratic analysts say that this is taking off in a way that some of Donald Trump's more offensive comments have not taken off. And this wasn't even Donald Trump. It was a comedian who was introducing him or, setting the stage for him at this rally. But the backlash has been intense, and it's now in its second or third day.
Right. So we'll have to see if there will be another October surprise that will surprise us or not. Now, as for South Korea, depending on which candidate wins, there could be significant implications for U.S.-South Korea relations and U.S.-North Korea relations as well. What should South Korea prioritize to prepare for different election outcome scenarios, Mr. Lee?
So I think, fundamentally, if Vice President Harris were to win the election on November 5th, credit where credit is due. So the Biden administration has done a lot of work to improve the ROK-US alliance in the last 4 years. So I think we're going to expect to see that further continue under a Harris administration. But I think, they're really going to be working towards how to optimize the ROK-US alliance to deal with this, unprecedented challenge by North Korea in Russia and their collaboration. In terms of how the Harris administration would deal with North Korea, I think we can expect a lot of the status quo to be continued, but also, sort of this developing of unilateral partnerships. So we had, for instance, recently the multinational sanctions monitoring team. So basically the United States and some of its key allies and partners, including Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and others, come together in the absence of the UN Security Council panel of experts being disbanded by Russia. So I think we're going to see that effort continue. Now, really, the real question, I guess, for South Korea and other U.S. allies is if President Trump wins. And so I think we will obviously expect a massive crisis in cost-sharing negotiations. President Trump has been very clear that he does not think the current arrangement is satisfactory. On the campaign trail, he's talked about $5 billion, even $10 billion in terms of special measures agreement renegotiations. So there's going to be a very big demand coming, and I think South Korea is going to get ready for that, but also other U.S. allies. In terms of how President Trump will deal with North Korea, and going back to our discussion earlier, it really depends on whether Kim Jong-un approaches him with flattery or with, fire and fury and more nuclear, threats. So I think that will really depend, but that will shape and take place within what Russia and China are already doing. So it's not going to be happening in a vacuum, I think, but there's certainly a lot of worried people, I think.
All right. Thank you for providing a potential clear picture of the future situations. I'm afraid we'll have to end it just right here. Mr. Lee and Chris, thank you so much for your insights and time tonight. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.